Chapter 1: The Dream of the Moon, Myths and Early Ideas. Since the beginning of human history, people have looked into the night sky and seen a mysterious, silvery glowing star, the moon. He was a companion of the night, a pace-setter of time, a symbol of change and return. Long before anyone thought of scientifically investigating or even traveling to the moon, it played a central role in myths, religions, and worldviews. The dream of reaching the moon is therefore far older than the technology of space travel. It is deeply rooted in the cultural history of mankind. In many early cultures, the moon was considered a divine being. In Mesopotamia, he was worshipped as the god Sin, in Egypt as Thoth, by the Greeks as Selene or Artemis, by the Romans as Luna. The moon was not just an object in the sky, but a living actor that influenced the fate of people. His cycles determined the calendars, regulated agriculture, and provided orientation in time. The change from new moon to full moon was a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. The myths of the moon also tell of longing and distance. Some peoples believed that beings lived on the moon, gods, spirits, or even humans. In Chinese legends, the moon goddess Chang'e lives on the moon, accompanied by a jade rabbit who prepares the potion of immortality there. In India, people speak of Chandra, the moon god who watches over night and fertility. There are also ancient stories in Western culture, from the man in the moon, which becomes visible when you look at the dark structures of the lunar seas, to fairy tales in which the moon acts as a mysterious power on the earth. Early on, the moon was associated with the idea of the unattainable. Its cold light was different from that of the sun, more mysterious, more distant, almost supernatural. Poets and philosophers raved about him. The moon became a symbol of longing, of the distant, of the unattainable. He stood for romance, for dreaming, but also for the unknown. But people were not satisfied with the myths alone. Even in ancient times, thinkers began to think about the nature of the moon. The Greek philosopher Anaxagoras, for example, explained in the 5th century BC that the moon was not a divine being, but a stone-like celestial body that reflected the light of the sun. A revolutionary idea in a time when celestial bodies were mostly understood as divine. Aristotle also dealt with the moon, albeit from his geocentric point of view, which placed the Earth at the center. The question of whether the moon was inhabited occupied people for centuries. Even in ancient times, there was speculation about Selenites, hypothetical inhabitants of the moon. Plutarch and Lucian wrote fantastic stories about journeys to the moon. Lucian's work, True Stories, from the 2nd century AD in particular, contains passages that can be considered the first literary account of space travel. Although they were meant to be satirical, they showed that the thought of visiting the moon fired the imagination early on. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, thinking about the moon took on new forms. With the upswing of astronomy through Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, the moon was recognized as an Earth-like body. Galileo was one of the first to study the surface of the moon with a telescope. His drawings of craters and mountains refuted the idea that the moon was a smooth, perfect sphere. Instead, a landscape was revealed, rough, full of structures, almost like the Earth itself. The moon thus became more tangible, more realistic, and at the same time, it moved closer to the idea that it might one day be reached. Literature and art took up these new ideas. In the 17th century, the first utopian travelogues appeared, which can be regarded as precursors of science fiction. Cyrano de Bergerac wrote The Journey to the Moon, in which he described fantastic methods to get there, for example, through rockets and bottles or through mirrors that use sunlight. Such works were not scientific, but they showed that the moon was increasingly moving into the realm of the imaginable, as the goal of human longing. In the 19th century, the idea of a trip to the moon took concrete shape. With the development of rocket research and the increasing popularity of scientific literature, the idea grew that humans could actually reach the moon one day. Jules Verne published his novel From the Earth to the Moon in 1865, in which he described a journey in a giant cannonball. Even though his technique was fantastic, his work was characterized by scientific curiosity. Verne had his heroes discuss speed, gravity, and trajectories, topics that would later play a central role in real space travel. So the dream of the moon has always been both myth and science, poetry and technology. On the one hand, a symbol of the unattainable. On the other hand, a goal that began to be grasped step by step. For thousands of years, the moon was a mirror of human imagination, and at the same time, a touchstone for knowledge. This dream eventually led to the 20th century, when technology, politics, and science met. Longing became goal, fantasy became program. The space race was not only a chapter of the Cold War, but also the realization of a vision as old as humanity itself: to set foot on the moon, the faithful companion of the night with one's feet. Chapter 2: First Steps in Astronomy, from Galileo to Newton. The dream of the moon and the question of the stars were given a new basis in the 16th and 17th centuries. With the scientific revolution, humanity began to consider heaven no longer just as a divine sphere, but as a world that functions with the same laws as the Earth. This was a decisive step, especially for the moon. A mysterious celestial light became a concrete celestial body that could be described, measured, and understood. One of the first great pioneers was Nicolaus Copernicus. In his work De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, 1543, he challenged the prevailing idea of the time that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Instead, he put the sun in the center and explained that the Earth, together with the moon, orbits around it. In doing so, he not only changed the view of the world, but also the relationship of humans to the moon. He was no longer a divine companion of the Earth, but a part of a cosmic system that was determined by motion and lawfulness. The real revolution, however, came with Galileo Galilei. In 1609, he pointed a telescope at the sky for the first time, an instrument that had originally been developed for seafaring, but which he turned into a tool of astronomy. With this view through the telescope, he discovered something sensational. On the moon, he found craters, mountains, and valleys. He drew maps of the moon's surface, refuting the idea that the moon was a perfectly smooth and flawless sphere. Rather, it resembled the Earth in its structure. For Galileo, it was clear: the moon is a world like ours, only distant and unreachable. His observations had enormous consequences. They questioned the separation between the imperishable sphere of heaven and the transient world of the Earth. If the moon has a landscape, then it could also be a place that is subject to other processes, perhaps even habitable. The boundaries between Earth and heaven began to blur. Johannes Kepler, a contemporary of Galileo, took up these ideas and developed them further. He became famous for his 3 Kepler laws, which describe the motion of the planets around the sun. But Kepler also dreamed of the moon. In his essay, Somnium, the Dream, he described a fictitious journey there, a mixture of scientific speculation and fantastic narrative. He described not only the difficulties of the flight, but also what the Earth would look like from the moon, as a brightly shining planet in the sky. In doing so, he brought a new perspective to thinking: the view of our world from the outside. The scientific revolution culminated in the work of Isaac Newton. With his Principia Mathematica, 1687, he formulated the laws of mechanics and gravitation. Newton showed that the same forces that cause an apple to fall on Earth also keep the moon in its orbit. In doing so, he connected heaven and earth by a single law. The moon was no longer a mysterious independent being, but a celestial body that obeyed the same physical rules as everything else in the universe. Newton's theory was a milestone. It made it possible to precisely calculate the movements of planets and satellites. For the first time, it was possible to imagine how a trajectory to the moon could be planned. Even though it would take centuries before rockets were built, Newton laid the mathematical foundations for space travel. However, this time was not only characterized by sober science, but also by imagination and pioneering spirit. Authors such as Francis Godwin, The Man in the Moon, 1638, or Cyrano de Bergerac wrote of journeys to the moon using fantastic machines, birds, or mirrors. Even though these stories often sounded fairy tale-like, they reflected the fascination that new scientific findings evoked. The moon was no longer just a distant dream, but a goal that could be imagined, at least theoretically. In the 18th century, interest in astronomy continued to grow. Observations became more precise, telescopes more powerful. Astronomers such as William Herschel mapped the moon and speculated about the possibility of life there. Some believed that there could be plants or even cities on the moon. Such ideas may seem naive to us today, but they show how much the moon had gone from being a divine symbol to a potential second world in people's consciousness. This development also had a cultural dimension. The moon no longer appeared only in myths and poems, but also in scientific treatises, in maps and sketches. It became the object of research, the projection surface of reason. Humanity began to measure it step by step, even if it was still far from reaching it. In the 18th century, interest in astronomy continued to grow. Observations became more precise, telescopes more powerful. Astronomers such as William Herschel mapped the moon and speculated about the possibility of life there. Some believed that there could be plants or even cities on the moon. Such ideas may seem naive to us today, but they show how much the moon had gone from being a divine symbol to a potential second world in people's consciousness. This development also had a cultural dimension. The moon no longer appeared only in myths and poems, but also in scientific treatises, in maps and sketches. It became the object of research, the projection surface of reason. Humanity began to measure it step by step, even if it was still far from reaching it. From Copernicus to Galileo, Kepler to Newton, there was a line. The moon was no longer unreachable, but a part of the same cosmos to which the Earth belongs. The next step was not only to observe, but to seriously consider the possibility of traveling there. This was not to happen until the modern age, when rockets and modern physics created the technical prerequisites. But the spiritual foundation was laid. Thanks to the scientific revolution, the moon had entered the realm of calculation from the realm of myths. And with that, the stage was set for those pioneers who not only dreamed of it, but also developed the tools that would one day actually make the path to the moon possible. Chapter 3. Rocket Pioneers: Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, Oberth. The scientific revolution had laid the foundations. The laws of gravity were now understood, movements could be calculated, and celestial bodies could be measured. But to actually reach the moon, it took more than just mathematics. It needed technology, machines powerful enough to leave Earth and precise enough to steer into space. This is where the story of the rocket pioneers begins, those visionaries who, long before space technology, had the courage to think the impossible and take their first practical steps. Rockets are not an invention of modern times. As early as the Middle Ages, fireworks and primitive rockets were used as weapons in China. But these had only short ranges and were hardly controllable. In order to get into space, completely new concepts had to be developed. The first was Konstantin Edwardovich Tsiolkovsky, a Russian teacher and autodidact who is now considered the father of space travel. Tsiolkovsky, born in 1857, grew up in modest circumstances. He was a mathematics teacher by profession, but his passion was astronomy and technology. He dreamed that man could conquer space. In his writings, he developed ideas that sounded almost unbelievable at the time: space stations, solar panels, multi-stage rockets. His most famous contribution is the rocket equation, which describes the speed a rocket can reach depending on the outflow velocity of the fuel and the mass of the rocket. With this formula, he proved that travel into space is theoretically possible if you only build powerful enough rockets. Tsiolkovsky saw space travel not only as a technical challenge, but also as a task for humanity. He believed that the future of humanity lay in space, that we would colonize other planets. His visions were far beyond his time, and yet they laid the theoretical basis for everything that came later. While Tsiolkovsky was primarily a theoretician, Robert Goddard, the first major practical rocket builder, appeared in the USA. Goddard, born in 1882, was fascinated by space travel from his youth. As a child, he had read Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and dreamed of building rockets that could one day actually conquer the sky. In 1919, Goddard published a paper in which he argued that rockets could be used not only for war, but also for scientific purposes. He was convinced that one day they would reach space. The press made fun of him. Newspapers mockingly wrote that he was a dreamer who did not understand that missiles could not fly in a vacuum. As a physicist, Goddard had long since proven that rockets work by recoil principle, independent of air. Goddard was not discouraged. In the 1920s and 30s, he built the first rockets with liquid fuel. In 1926, he succeeded in launching such a rocket for the first time. An inconspicuous flight over a few seconds, but in truth, the beginning of modern space travel. Goddard experimented with stabilization fins, gyroscopes for control, and high-pressure tanks, all principles that were later used in large space rockets. He mostly worked in secret, often without much support, but his pioneering technical achievements paved the way for all who came after him. At the same time, Hermann Oberth, born in Transylvania in 1894, was active in Europe. He was also inspired by Jules Verne from his youth. His book, The Rocket to the Planetary Spaces, 1923, was a milestone. In it, he detailed how rockets would have to be built to reach space. Oberth was not only a theoretician, but also a brilliant engineer who drafted concrete construction plans. Oberth's work inspired an entire generation of young engineers and enthusiasts. In Germany, rocket clubs were formed in which experiments were carried out. One of the young men who was infected by this was Wernher von Braun, later the mastermind behind the Saturn V rocket that was actually supposed to take people to the moon. Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth worked in different countries, often independently of each other. But together, they created the foundation of space travel. Tsiolkovsky provided the theory, Goddard the first practical experiments, Oberth the bridge between science and engineering. They all had to contend with ridicule, skepticism, and financial difficulties, but they did not give up because they had a vision, to free man from the limits of the earth. Her work took place at a time when the world was changing rapidly. Technology, industry, and science developed at an unimaginable speed. Airplanes had conquered the skies, and it seemed only a matter of time before space would follow. What was still considered science fiction moved into the realm of possibility. In the 1930s, military institutions also began to recognize the potential of the rocket. Especially in Germany, Oberth's ideas were taken up to develop rocket weapons. This would later become the V-2, the first rocket to touch space. This began a new chapter in which the visions of the pioneers became reality, but initially in the shadow of war and destruction. But the foundation was laid. Without Tsiolkovsky's formulas, Goddard's experiments, and Oberth's plans, the Apollo program would never have existed. They were the visionaries who opened the door. The moon was still out of reach for them, but they showed the way to reach it one day, with courage, perseverance, and the power of technology.
Chapter 4: The Dawn of the Space Age, Sputnik and the V-2.
The ideas of Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth had paved the way, but the very beginning of the space age was closely linked to war, destruction, and political race. The rocket that would later carry man to the moon was initially created as a weapon, the V-2. Only after that did this technology turn into the means by which humanity reached space. During the Second World War, German engineers under the direction of Wernher von Braun worked in Peenemünde on a rocket that was far more powerful than anything that had ever existed before. Its name, Aggregat 4, better known as V2, Retaliation Weapon 2. With a height of almost 14 meters and a takeoff weight of around 13 tons, it was able to transport 1 ton of explosives over 300 kilometers, far enough to reach London or Antwerp from Germany. The V-2 was the first rocket to break through the barrier to space. During its flights, it climbed up to 90 kilometers high, far above the atmosphere, before falling down on its target. This made it a technical marvel, but at the same time an instrument of destruction. Thousands of people died as a result of their operations, and even more died in the production facilities where forced laborers had to manufacture the rockets under inhumane conditions. Technically, the V-2 was a forerunner of all later space rockets. It used liquid propellant, gyroscopes for control, and aerodynamic stabilization. It proved that rockets do not only work in the laboratory or on test fields, but are capable of piercing the sky. For von Braun and his engineers, the V-2 was also a step towards their actual vision, space travel. But there was no room for this in the war. The rocket served solely for military logic. When the war ended in 1945, a race for the knowledge of German rocket engineers began. The US and the Soviet Union realized that the missile could be crucial for the future, not only as a weapon, but also as a strategic tool. In Operation Paperclip, the Americans brought Wernher von Braun and many of his associates to the United States. There, they first worked for the military, later for NASA. The Soviets also secured parts of the Peenemünde technology and brought German specialists to the Soviet Union. This competition gave rise to the space race. The USA and the Soviet Union, now the two superpowers of the Cold War, tried to outdo each other in science, technology, and prestige. Missiles played a key role in this. They could not only launch satellites, but also carry nuclear bombs in an emergency. The space race was therefore also a military race from the beginning. The first major breakthrough was achieved by the Soviets. On October 4, 1957, they launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite on Earth. A shiny metal ball of just 58 centimeters in diameter, which sent out a simple radio signal, beep, beep, but its effect was gigantic. For the first time, humanity had created its own celestial body orbiting the Earth. The dream of the pioneers had become reality. We had reached space. Sputnik was not only a technical triumph, but also a political one. It triggered a shockwave in the USA. Suddenly, it seemed as if the Soviets were superior, not only in space, but also in the ability to build rockets that could reach any point on Earth. Newspapers spoke of a Sputnik shock. The U.S. government responded with massive investments in education, science, and space. Meanwhile, the Soviets did not rest. Just a few months after Sputnik, Sputnik 2 followed, with the dog Laika on board, the first living being in orbit. Finally, in 1961, the next historic step was taken. Yuri Gagarin became the first person to circumnavigate the Earth. The first man in space became the hero of an entire epic and a symbol of Soviet superiority. In 1958, they founded the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Military rocket programs now developed into a civilian space agency that was to take up the race with the Soviets. Von Braun, once a rocket builder for the V-2, now became the architect of the American launch vehicles. The beginning of the space age was therefore marked by ambivalence. Technology, born of destruction and war, became a means of scientific curiosity and human longing. The V-2, once a weapon, became the starting point of the Saturn V, which was supposed to take people to the moon. Sputnik, a small satellite, became the symbol of a new era. But this space race was more than a technical race. It was a political spectacle, a struggle for prestige and power. Each nation wanted to show that it was superior not only militarily, but also scientifically and culturally. The moon, a dream and a place of longing for thousands of years, now moved into the center of this competition. Anyone who reached the moon would not only accomplish a technical masterpiece, but also set a political signal. There was still a long way to go. But the first step had been taken. Man had entered space. Weapons of war had become spacecraft. And out of the rivalry of the superpowers arose a dynamic that would take humanity further in just a few years than ever before in its history. Chapter 5: Cold War and Space Race. The Second World War was over, but the world remained divided. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other in an ideological, political, and military conflict that was soon called the Cold War. It was a competition between two systems, capitalism and democracy on the one hand, communism and a centrally planned economy on the other. Both superpowers wanted to prove their superiority, not only with weapons, but also with science, technology, and culture. Space became one of the central battlefields of this global competition. The Soviet Union had impressively presented Sputnik in 1957 and Gagarin's flight in 1961. These successes were not only technical feats, but also propagandistic triumphs. Suddenly, it seemed as if communism was the driving force of the future, while the USA had fallen behind. In Washington, it was clear that they had to react, quickly and decisively. On May 25, 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy gave a speech to Congress that became the birth of the Apollo program. He said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." These words were not just an announcement, but an obligation. Kennedy set the most ambitious goal in human history, a manned moon landing within a few years. Why the moon? Because it represented a clear, visible goal that promised prestige. The Soviets had already managed to put a satellite into orbit or send people into space. But reaching the moon, that was the ultimate challenge. Whoever was there first would be considered the winner of the space race. The Cold War gave space travel enormous resources. Billions of dollars have been invested in research, development, and education. Engineers, scientists, pilots, entire generations were now working towards a single goal. In the USA, NASA emerged as the central agency that coordinated these efforts. Wernher von Braun and his team in Huntsville, Alabama, developed the huge launch vehicles necessary to take people and equipment to the moon. The Soviets also worked feverishly on their own lunar programs. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, was the driving force behind Sputnik and Gagarin's flight. Under his leadership, the massive N-1 rocket was created, which was to become the Soviet answer to the American Saturn V. But the Soviet program was marked by secrecy, political intrigue, and technical problems. After Korolev's death in 1966, it lost its cohesion. In the 1960s, a series of milestones followed that made the space race visible. The Soviets scored with the first spacewalk, Alexei Leonov 1965, and unmanned lunar probes that sent images from the surface. The Americans responded with the Mercury and Gemini programs, in which they tested basic skills, long stays in space, rendezvous and docking maneuvers, extravehicular activities. Each flight was a test run for the big goal, the moon. But the race was not just a question of technology, it was also a propaganda war. Each nation presented its successes as proof of the superiority of its system. Newspapers, radio, and television reported enthusiastically, and the world was eagerly following who would take the next steps. For millions of people, space travel became a symbol of hope and progress, but also of competition and national pride. Kennedy himself did not live to see the moon landing. After his assassination in 1963, his successors took over the program, but his promise remained a leitmotif. Precisely because it was so bold, it gave NASA tremendous momentum. Engineers developed new materials, computers, navigation systems, technologies that had an impact far beyond space travel. At the same time, the danger remained in the background. The space race was also a race of missiles that could carry nuclear warheads in an emergency. Many of the technologies that brought humans to the moon were originally developed for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Cold War thus gave space travel a double character. It was a scientific dream and a military power game at the same time. For the population, however, the fascination was strongest. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts or cosmonauts. Science fiction boomed. Series such as Star Trek reflected the enthusiasm. The moon, a place of longing for thousands of years, was now suddenly within reach. The Cold War thus created a paradoxical situation. Fear of the superiority of the opponent gave rise to a competition that in less than 2 decades brought humanity to a point that generations before had not even dared to dream of. Without this race, without the political urgency, the moon landing would probably have taken place much later, if at all. When the Apollo rockets were launched, it was clear that it was not just about science. It was about showing the world which system determined the future. The moon was not just a celestial body, but a symbol of the Cold War. Whoever landed there first would make history. Chapter 6: NASA and the Apollo Program. With the founding of NASA in 1958, a new era of space travel began. What was initially intended as a reaction to the Sputnik shock quickly developed into one of the largest scientific and technical undertakings in human history. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, united various research institutions, military projects, and rocket development programs under one roof. It was not only intended to catch up with the Soviet Union, but also to put the USA at the forefront of space travel. NASA set up ambitious programs in the first few years. Mercury was the first U.S. astronaut to be launched into space, still in cramped capsules and on short flights. John Glenn made history when he became the first American to circumnavigate the Earth in 1962. This was followed by the Gemini program, which paved the way for Apollo. In Gemini missions, essential capabilities were tested: longer stays in orbit, rendezvous and docking maneuvers between spacecraft, extravehicular activities. Everything that was later needed for a moon landing had to be tested here. But the heart of the program was the Apollo program. It originated directly from Kennedy's moon speech of 1961. The goal: before this decade is out, even before 1970, Americans should land on the moon and return safely. This goal was unprecedented. Never before had a nation set itself such a clear and binding task of such a formidable technical and organizational task. Apollo was not just a rocket project, but a gigantic undertaking that employed hundreds of thousands of people. More than 400,000 engineers, scientists, technicians, and workers worked on the program at peak times. The costs amounted to around $25 billion US, several hundred billion in today's value. Factories, universities, research institutions throughout the country were involved. The technical challenge was enormous. It needed a rocket powerful enough to carry a payload of over 40 tons to the moon, the Saturn V. Under the direction of Wernher von Braun and his team at the Marshall Space Flight Center, the largest rocket of all time, a Colossus 110 meters high, was created. It consisted of 3 stages, which were ignited one after the other and brought the space capsule into lunar orbit. Each stage was a masterpiece of engineering, and each had to function perfectly. A single mistake would have jeopardized the mission. In addition to the rocket, a spacecraft had to be developed that was capable not only of taking astronauts to the moon, but also of landing and taking off again. The result was the Apollo spacecraft, consisting of three modules: the command module, where astronauts spent most of their time; the service module, which contained fuel, electricity, and life support systems; and the lunar module, which was specifically designed for landing and launching on the moon. The planning was meticulous. Every movement, every orbit, every maneuver had to be calculated and simulated. Computers played a decisive role in this, albeit computers that seemed primitive by today's standards. The Apollo guidance computer had less computing power than a modern calculator, but it was robust, reliable, and specifically designed for space operations. The astronauts also had to be prepared intensively. They were sent into survival training, learned navigation, astronomy, technology, medicine. They trained in underwater pools to simulate weightlessness and in giant centrifuges to endure the stresses of takeoff and landing. Many of them were experienced test pilots, used to extreme situations and tough discipline. The Apollo program has had ups and downs. The most tragic moment was in 1967 when a fire broke out during a ground test of the Apollo 1 mission. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed. This shock almost ended the program, but NASA responded with comprehensive improvements in technology and safety. The program was tested more closely and, in the end, more robust and reliable. In addition to the rocket, a spacecraft had to be developed that was capable not only of taking astronauts to the moon, but also of landing and taking off again. The result was the Apollo spacecraft, consisting of three modules: the command module, where astronauts spent most of their time; the service module, which contained fuel, electricity, and life support systems; and the lunar module, which was specifically designed for landing and launching on the moon. The planning was meticulous. Every movement, every orbit, every maneuver had to be calculated and simulated. Computers played a decisive role in this, albeit computers that seemed primitive by today's standards. The Apollo guidance computer had less computing power than a modern calculator, but it was robust, reliable, and specifically designed for space operations. The astronauts also had to be prepared intensively. They were sent into survival training, learned navigation, astronomy, technology, medicine. They trained in underwater pools to simulate weightlessness and in giant centrifuges to endure the stresses of takeoff and landing. Many of them were experienced test pilots, used to extreme situations and tough discipline. The Apollo program has had ups and downs. The most tragic moment was in 1967 when a fire broke out during a ground test of the Apollo 1 mission. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed. This shock almost ended the program, but NASA responded with comprehensive improvements in technology and safety. The program was tested more closely and, in the end, more robust and reliable. In the years that followed, the Apollo missions gradually became more complex. Apollo 7 tested the spacecraft in orbit for the first time. Apollo 8 was the first mission to orbit the moon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar landing module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 flew a dress rehearsal up to a few kilometers above the lunar surface. Each of these steps was necessary to achieve the great goal, Apollo 11. The Apollo program was therefore more than just a technical project. It was a national effort, a political signal, a cultural event. Millions of people watched each mission live on television. Children collected collectible pictures of astronauts. Adults discussed moon maps. The Apollo astronauts became heroes, symbolic figures of a society that believed that with science and courage, anything was possible. But the reality of the Cold War remained in the background. Each successful mission was not only a scientific step, but also a victory in the geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union. The moon was the symbol, but behind it was the question, which system will lead humanity into the future? When Apollo 11 actually reached the moon in July 1969, it was the culmination of this program. But it was a long road to get there, full of risks, innovations, and sacrifices. The Apollo program was a triumph of organization, science, and human will, And it showed what humanity is capable of when it focuses its forces on a common goal. Chapter 7. The Technology of the Saturn V. When you think of the moon landing, you think of the words of Neil Armstrong, the flag in the gray dust, or the pictures of the astronauts. But none of this would have been possible without the rocket that took them there, the Saturn V. It was the technical heart of the Apollo program, a giant of steel and aluminum, larger and stronger than anything mankind had built up to that point. To this day, it is considered the most powerful rocket ever to have flown successfully. The Saturn V was a colossus, 110 meters high, almost as high as a 36-story skyscraper. Its takeoff weight was around 2,900 tons, heavier than a fully loaded ocean liner. Their starting power corresponded to that of around 160 million horsepower. At launch, it burned several tons of fuel every second, creating a huge flame and thunder that could be heard for miles. For many spectators who witnessed the launches live at the Kennedy Space Center, it was an overwhelming experience, a mixture of the force of nature and human engineering. The rocket consisted of 3 main stages, which were ignited one after the other. Each had its own task, and each had to function perfectly for the mission to succeed. The first stage, the SIC, was 42 meters high and contained 5 massive F-1 engines, the largest liquid propellant engines ever built. They burned kerosene and liquid oxygen and produced a thrust of 34 million newtons. In just 2.5 minutes, this stage brought the rocket to an altitude of 68 kilometers and a speed of 8,600 kilometers per hour. After that, it was severed and fell into the sea. The second stage, the S2, was equipped with 5 J2 engines powered by liquid hydrogen and oxygen, a fuel that was particularly efficient but also technically challenging. It took the rocket to an altitude of almost 200 kilometers and accelerated it to 24,000 kilometers per hour. The third stage, the SI-4B, had only 1 J2 engine, but it was crucial. First, it brought the Apollo capsule into Earth orbit. After a short stop in which all systems were checked, it was ignited again, the famous translunar injection maneuver. With this, Apollo left Earth's orbit and was sent on a trajectory to the moon. Above the steps was the Apollo spacecraft with the modules, protected by a fairing and equipped with a rescue tower that could catapult the astronauts away in an emergency in the event of launch problems. The Saturn V was a technical masterpiece, but also a logistical one. It was not built in one place, but in many factories in the USA that produced individual parts. In the Vehicle Assembly Building, VAB, in Cape Canaveral, one of the largest buildings in the world, the steps were assembled. From there, the rocket rolled slowly to the launch pad on a gigantic caterpillar, the Crawler Transporter, at a speed of only 1.6 kilometers per hour. The itself was already a spectacle. The development of the Saturn V was full of challenges. Liquid hydrogen had to be stored at minus 253 degrees Celsius, an extreme technical problem. The control of the rocket, which comprised millions of parts, required a sophisticated guidance system. The weight had to be minimized without compromising stability. Every single screw, every cable had to meet the highest standards because a mistake could be catastrophic. The guidance system was housed in the instrument unit at the upper end of the third stage. There were computers, navigation devices, and sensors that controlled the rocket during the flight. Despite its enormous size, the Saturn V was highly precise. It could transport a payload of around 45 tons to the moon, with an accuracy of a few kilometers after hundreds of thousands of kilometers of flight. The launch itself was also a masterpiece of coordination. Thousands of engineers worked together in launch control. Every second was monitored. The ignition of the F-1 engines took place in a precise sequence so that the enormous forces remained controlled. When the Saturn V lifted off, the Earth shook and a cloud of fire and smoke spread across the launch pad. Between 1967 and 1973, a total of 13 Saturn V rockets were launched, including all Apollo missions to the Moon. Not a single one of these rockets failed at launch, a testament to the quality and reliability that the program achieved. Their launches are still among the most impressive moments in the history of technology. But the Saturn V was not just a technical object, she was a symbol. For the Americans, it stood for progress, strength, and the ability to make the impossible possible. To the world, it was a sign that humanity was indeed capable of overstepping its limits. After Apollo 17 in 1972, the Saturn V was no longer used. The high costs and the end of the lunar program made further launches unnecessary. Some unused examples are now in museums, in Houston, Huntsville, and at the Kennedy Space Center. Visitors can walk under them and feel the dimensions of this project. Even decades later, no rocket has surpassed the Saturn V in its combination of size, performance, and track record. Modern launch vehicles such as the Falcon Heavy or the Space Launch System achieve similar or greater performance, but the Saturn V remains the original, the rocket that made the dream of the Moon come true.
Chapter 8. Training the Astronauts, Courage and Discipline. The Saturn V was the machine that took the astronauts to the Moon. But without the people on board, who were willing to risk their lives, the moon landing would never have become a reality. Being an astronaut meant much more than sitting in a rocket and pressing buttons. It required courage, discipline, physical toughness, technical knowledge, and psychological stability. The training that the Apollo astronauts underwent was one of the toughest and most demanding in the history of manned spaceflight. The selection of astronauts began strictly. NASA was looking for men who were physically fit, mentally flexible, and technically adept. Almost all the candidates had a military background. Many were test pilots who were used to working in extreme conditions. They had to be able to make decisions quickly, even if the risk was fatal. In addition to flying skills, discipline, the ability to work in a team, and the ability to follow orders counted. As soon as the astronauts were selected, several years of training began. This included a variety of disciplines that covered the entire course of a mission. They had to learn to operate the complex systems of the Apollo spacecraft, to understand navigation instruments, to enter computer programs. They studied astronomy to use constellations for orientation, and meteorology to assess weather conditions. A crucial part of the training was the physical preparation. In weightlessness, the stresses on the body change dramatically. Muscles break down, bones lose calcium, the cardiovascular system reacts sensitively. To combat this, the astronauts had to exercise regularly and keep their fitness at a high level. Training in the centrifuge was particularly feared. Launches and re-entry maneuvers were simulated there. The astronauts had to withstand accelerations of up to 8 g, 8 times their body weight. Anyone who lost consciousness in the centrifuge had to learn to use special breathing techniques to keep the blood in the brain. Another central element was underwater training. Since there is no real weightlessness on Earth, NASA used large water tanks to simulate the feeling of floating. In these pools, the astronauts practiced working in the spacesuit, movements, operating tools, climbing, and belaying. The training was exhausting because the suits were heavy and unwieldy. The water offered resistance, and the exercises often lasted hours. Survival training was also part of the program. It was imagined that an Apollo capsule could land in inhospitable regions, in the desert, in the jungle, or in the ocean, after a failed launch or an emergency landing. Therefore, the astronauts learned to survive in the wilderness, to make fires, to find food, to provide first aid. In Florida, they trained to survive in the swamps, in Nevada to survive in the desert, and in Alaska to survive in the cold. The psychological training was just as important as the physical training. The astronauts had to live with the same colleagues in cramped capsules for hours or days. Confinement, isolation, monotony, this could lead to stress and conflicts. NASA made sure that the crews harmonized well with each other. Sometimes luck also played a role. Personal tensions could weigh on a mission, while a strong team could overcome any crisis together.
The training for the moon landing itself was particularly intensive. Controlling the lunar module was highly complex, and landing on a strange, uneven surface was fraught with risks. To practice this, engineers developed special simulators. The most famous was the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, LLTV, a strange-looking aircraft with a central jet engine designed to simulate the lunar lander's flight behavior in low gravity. Many astronauts found it extremely dangerous. Neil Armstrong once had to jump out with the ejection seat when the device got out of control. Geology was also part of the training, because the astronauts were not only to land on the moon, but also to collect scientific samples. They were sent to deserts and volcanic regions to identify rocks and take samples. Experts explained to them how to select and document scientifically relevant pieces. In this way, the astronauts were to become practical geologists in spacesuits. The training was designed to push the astronauts to the limits of their capabilities. Everyone had to prove that they could keep calm in extreme situations. Checklists, procedures, and protocols were run through so often that they ran almost automatically in an emergency. To the public, the astronauts seemed like heroes, charming, courageous, flawless. But behind this facade was an everyday life full of hard work, deprivation, and also risks. Many astronauts experienced accidents during training. Some died. Everyone knew that a mistake could cost not only one's mission, but also one's own life. In the end, however, the practice was exactly what made the difference. When Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, their ability to act calmly and precisely under pressure was crucial. Without years of preparation, without the discipline and courage of the astronauts, the small step for a human would never have been possible.
Chapter 9. Apollo 1. Tragedy on the Ground. From the very beginning, the Apollo program was a gigantic challenge, full of risks and imponderables. The aim was to develop a technology that had never existed before in less than a decade. Mistakes were inevitable, and sometimes they cost lives. The greatest tragedy of the Apollo program occurred long before anyone reached the moon, the Apollo 1 accident. It was January 27, 1967, Cape Kennedy in Florida. The crew, consisting of Commander Virgil Gus Grissom, pilot Edward White, and pilot Roger Chaffee, were in the capsule for a test. It was not a launch, but a plugs-out simulation. The aim was to check whether the capsule operated all systems correctly even when it was disconnected from the power supply to the ground and relied only on its own batteries. The rocket was still on the ground. The flight was not planned until weeks later. But the conditions were critical. The capsule was pressurized with a pure oxygen atmosphere, which was common for the mission but posed an enormous risk during a ground test. In such an environment, any spark could ignite a fire that spreads explosively. The crew entered the capsule in the afternoon. Soon they reported technical problems, interference in the radio connections, difficulties with the systems. The atmosphere in the control room was tense. Then, at 6:31 p.m. local time, the engineers in the control center heard a scream, "Fire in the cockpit!" Seconds later, the radio broke off. In the capsule, a cable or a spark had started a fire. Within seconds, the interior turned into a ball of flame. The pure oxygen environment accelerated the fire so much that the astronauts had no chance. In addition, the hatch of the capsule had to be opened inwards and was blocked from the inside by the overpressure. Helpers on the ground desperately tried to open the hatch, but when they finally succeeded, it was too late. Grissom, White, and Chaffee had perished, suffocated or burned in the heat of the fire. The shock was enormous. 3 experienced astronauts, in the middle of a simple test, had lost their lives. The public asked questions. Was the Apollo program too ambitious, too hasty, too risky? Politicians discussed whether the entire moon mission should be stopped. For NASA, this was a moment of crisis, but also of reflection.
An investigative commission was immediately appointed. She found that the cockpit was full of flammable materials, nylon nets, cable insulation, and Velcro fasteners. The oxygen pressure was higher than necessary. The hatch was impractically designed. It was a chain of factors that together had made a catastrophe possible. The consequences were drastic, but necessary. The spaceship has been fundamentally reworked. Flammable materials have been replaced, cables have been better insulated, and the atmosphere inside has been changed. Above all, however, the hatch was designed in such a way that it could be opened outwards in a few seconds. Security was given the highest priority, even if it set the program back months, even years. The 3 astronauts of Apollo 1 were honored as heroes. Gus Grissom was an experienced astronaut who had already flown with Mercury and Gemini. Ed White had been the first American to undertake a spacewalk. Roger Chaffee was about to take his first flight, but he was highly respected. Their death was not in vain. The lessons learned from the disaster probably saved the lives of others later. For the astronauts themselves, the incident was a wake-up call. They knew that their profession was dangerous, but Apollo 1 made it clear that the danger was not only lurking in space, but began on the ground. Nevertheless, there were no retreats. None of the other astronauts resigned or refused to work. They wanted to complete the mission of their fallen colleagues. NASA itself also learned. People became more cautious, more systematic, more conscientious. Engineers later said that Apollo 1 was a tragedy, but at the same time, the moment when the program came of age. The hubris of the early years gave way to a new seriousness. The public continued to stand behind Apollo, partly because many recognized that big goals demand sacrifices. Kennedy had made a promise, and despite the disaster, the nation wanted to keep that promise. For many Americans, it was clear that if you really wanted to make your way to the moon, you couldn't shy away from setbacks. Apollo 1 was a dark chapter, but it also showed the strength of the program, learning from mistakes, acknowledging risks, and making improvements. Without this hard lesson, the path to the moon might have been even more dangerous. When Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins finally launched Apollo 11 in 1969, they did so in memory of Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Their names were in the background of every mission, a constant reminder that progress always demands sacrifices. Chapter 10: Apollo 8, the first orbit of the moon. After the Apollo 1 tragedy, NASA had revised the program, corrected errors, and significantly improved the safety of the space capsule. But time was ticking. Kennedy's promise to land humans on the moon before the end of the decade continued to be the benchmark. In 1968, the goal was within reach, and at the same time, the tension of the race with the Soviet Union was greater than ever. It was known that the Soviets were working on their own manned lunar program. So NASA decided to take a bold step. Apollo 8 was the first manned mission to orbit the moon. The decision was made at relatively short notice. Originally, Apollo 8 was planned as a test flight in Earth orbit, but reports of possible Soviet progress made NASA nervous. If the Soviets managed the first manned flight around the moon, it would be a loss of prestige for the USA. So it was decided to change the plan. Apollo 8 was to fly directly to the moon, without a dress rehearsal, without an unmanned test having been carried out near the moon beforehand. It was a risky step, but one that was to make history. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 was launched from the Kennedy Space Center. On board were 3 astronauts, Commander Frank Borman, pilot James Lovell, and pilot William Anders. It was the first manned mission with the mighty Saturn V, the rocket that would later carry Apollo 11. Millions of people watched the launch on television, many with mixed feelings. Amazement at the size of the rocket, but also concern whether everything would go well. The start went smoothly. For the first time, a rocket put people on a trajectory that would take them over 380,000 kilometers to the moon. The journey lasted 3 days. During this time, the crew checked the systems, made small course corrections, and had plenty of time to look out of the windows. The Earth became smaller, the moon bigger. For the first time in history, man left the earthly sphere and entered the space between the celestial bodies. On December 24, 1968, Apollo 8 reached the moon. With a decisive maneuver, the third stage of the rocket ignited to swing the spacecraft into orbit. A mistake would have meant that the astronauts either flew past the moon or crashed. But everything worked. For the first time, humans orbited the moon, a moment of immeasurable symbolic significance. The astronauts reported live to Earth. Millions of people heard their voices as they described the lunar surface, a desolate, gray landscape full of craters and plains. But even more impressive was the sight of the Earth. During one orbit, William Anders took one of the most famous photos of all time, Earthrise, the rising of the Earth over the moon's horizon. For the first time, humanity saw its own world from the outside, as a fragile blue ball in black space. This image became a symbol that inspired the environmental movement and changed the way we look at our planet. On the evening of December 24th, the crew gave a Christmas speech from lunar orbit. Millions of people around the world listened as the astronauts read from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was a moment that combined technology, religion, and human history. For many, it was a moment of awe and unity, in the midst of a time marked by conflict, the Vietnam War, and social tensions. After 10 orbits around the moon and around 20 hours in lunar orbit, the astronauts ignited their engines again to initiate the return flight to Earth. This maneuver was also risky. A mistake would have meant that they would have remained trapped in lunar orbit. But here, too, everything worked as planned. 3 days later, on December 27th, Apollo 8 landed safely in the Pacific Ocean, where the astronauts were recovered from the USS Yorktown. Apollo 8 was a milestone. It was the first manned flight to leave the Earth, the first to reach the moon, and the first to show the Earth as a whole. Technically, the mission proved that the navigation, communication, and trajectories worked, an indispensable dress rehearsal for the later landing. Politically, it was a triumph. The USA had set the pace, the Soviets had overtaken. And on a human level, it was an experience of immeasurable symbolic power. Many historians see Apollo 8 as the mission that brought the real breakthrough. Apollo 11 may be the more famous, but Apollo 8 showed that the path to get there was realistic. It gave the engineers, the astronauts, and the world confidence that the moon landing was feasible. And it left behind a legacy that extends beyond space travel. The image of the Earth, small and vulnerable in the cosmos. This image reminded humanity that we all live on the same planet, a realization that would only grow in importance in the coming decades. Chapter 11, Apollo 11, Preparing for the First Landing. After the success of Apollo 8, it was clear that the moon landing was within reach. But there were still enormous challenges between an orbit of the moon and an actual landing. Every component, the Saturn V, the Apollo spacecraft, the lunar landing module, had to be tested in a real mission. At the same time, it was necessary to select the astronauts who would be the first people to set foot on the moon. Apollo 11 was the goal, but many hurdles had to be overcome before that happened. Initially, Apollo 9 played a decisive role. In March 1969, James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweickart tested the Lunar Landing Module, LM, for the first time in Earth orbit. This vehicle had been specially developed for landing on the moon, light, without aerodynamic shape, designed for vacuum and low gravity. Apollo 9 proved that the LM could work. It docked, separated, maneuvered, and returned safely. This clarified one of the biggest unknowns. Only 2 months later, Apollo 10 followed, the dress rehearsal. Tom Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan flew to the Moon in a Saturn V, swung into orbit, and tested the LM to within a few kilometers above the surface. They came so close that they flew over the landing site of Apollo 11. But they were not allowed to land. It was deliberately only an exercise. Apollo 10 proved that all systems were ready for landing. Meanwhile, preparations for Apollo 11 were in full swing. NASA selected 3 astronauts for this historic mission: Neil Armstrong as commander, Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin as pilot of the Lunar Landing Module, and Michael Collins as pilot of the Command Module. All 3 were experienced pilots. 2 already had space experience. Armstrong was known for his calmness and precision, Aldrin for his detailed technical knowledge, Collins for his reliability. It was a crew that was a perfect match. The preparation was intensive. Armstrong and Aldrin practiced the landing countless times in the simulator and in the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, which was designed to simulate the conditions of the Moon. They practiced emergencies, evasive maneuvers, procedures for every conceivable incident. Collins focused on the command ship, which had to remain in orbit and later secure its return. Mission planning was also a masterpiece. Engineers determined the landing site, the Mare Tranquillitatis, the Sea of Tranquility. This place was chosen because it seemed relatively flat and safe. Trajectories were calculated, radio connections tested, checklists refined. Every minute of the mission was planned in advance, from launch preparations to flight to landing and return. The public cheered along. Newspapers, radio, and television reported on progress almost daily. Millions of people knew that the summer of 1969 would bring a historic event. The race with the Soviet Union was at its peak, and all eyes were on NASA. Politically, the significance was enormous. President Richard Nixon had only taken office in January 1969. Success on the Moon would not only strengthen the U.S. in the Cold War, but also give Nixon himself political support. That's why nothing was left to chance. Security, public relations, international impact, everything was considered. The technology was also tested one last time. The Saturn V, which was to carry Apollo 11, was assembled in the Vehicle Assembly Building and driven to the launch pad. Engineers controlled every system, from the engines to the electronics to the life support systems of the spacesuits. Nothing could go wrong. The astronauts themselves were under enormous pressure. Armstrong knew that his name would forever be associated with this mission, whether it failed or succeeded. They gave interviews, became symbolic figures, and yet they had to stay focused. Aldrin wrote in his diary that he wavered between pride and nervousness. Collins, who would remain in orbit, knew that while he would not set foot on the Moon, he would still play a key role. On July 16, 1969, the time had come. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered around Cape Kennedy, millions in front of their televisions worldwide. The Saturn V stood on the launch pad, majestically against the blue Florida sky. In the early hours of the morning, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins boarded the Apollo spacecraft. The world held its breath. At 9:32 a.m. local time, the engines ignited. The Earth shook, fire and smoke rose, and the Saturn V rose into the sky. It was the beginning of the most important journey in the history of mankind. Apollo 11, the flight that was to make the dream of the Moon come true. But the biggest challenge still lay ahead of them, the actual landing. Because as careful as the preparation was, no one knew what would really happen when a man tried to touch down on the Moon for the first time. Chapter 12. July 20, 1969. One small step for man. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 left Earth. After a smooth launch, the Saturn V took the 3 astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins into Earth orbit. A few hours later, the third stage ignited again and set the spacecraft on course for the Moon. For 3 days, they traveled through space, moving further and further away from the Earth until it could only be seen as a blue ball in black space. Millions of people around the world followed the mission spellbound on TV or radio. On July 19th, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. There, the decisive phase began. The next day, July 20, 1969, the lunar landing module, Eagle, with Armstrong and Aldrin on board, was to undock and descend to the surface while Collins remained in orbit in the Columbia command module. Everything now depended on the precision of the processes and the nerves of the astronauts. The descent began in the afternoon. The Eagle's engines ignited, and the landing module detached from orbit. On the floor in the control center in Houston sat dozens of engineers who monitored every step. But communication was delayed, and many decisions had to be made by the astronauts themselves. Problems arose early on. The onboard computer of the landing module, with its modest computing power, was overloaded with data and repeatedly displayed warning messages. For a moment, there was uncertainty. Should the mission be aborted? But the flight controllers in Houston analyzed the situation at lightning speed and gave the green light. Armstrong and Aldrin flew on. As they approached the surface, Armstrong noticed that the intended landing site was full of large boulders. Touching down there would have jeopardized the landing. So he took control manually and looked for a more suitable place. At the same time, the fuel reserve dropped dangerously fast. Houston reported only 60 seconds, 1 minute of remaining fuel. Then 30 seconds. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Armstrong touched down the Eagle gently in a relatively flat area. His words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." "Houston, this is Basis Tranquility. The Eagle has landed." Cheers broke out in the control center as well around the world. People were in each other's arms, tears flowed, TVs showed live images. For the first time in history, a man had reached another celestial body. But the mission was not over yet. Armstrong and Aldrin prepared to leave. For hours they checked systems, put on the spacesuits, checked oxygen tanks and communication equipment. The tension rose immeasurably. Millions of people around the world were waiting to see the moment live. At 3:56 a.m. Central European Time on July 21, 1969, Armstrong opened the hatch and began the descent via the ladder of the landing module. The camera transmitted every image. Then he put his left foot in the gray dust of the moon. His words went down in history. "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." This is a small step for a human being, but a giant leap for humanity. Shortly afterwards, Aldrin followed. He poetically described the surface as magnificent desolation. Together, the two moved across the lunar surface, hopped in low gravity, set up experiments, collected rock samples. They hoisted the American flag, telephoned President Nixon, who praised them as the greatest achievement of mankind. Armstrong and Aldrin spent about 2.5 hours outside the landing module. Their movements were laborious, the spacesuits heavy, the visor fogged up slightly. But the images that were sent to Earth had an effect that exceeded anything imagined. Around 600 million people watched the first moonwalk live, more than ever before at an event. Meanwhile, Michael Collins, who remained in orbit, saw the far side of the moon alone, cut off from all communication with Earth. Later he said he did not feel lonely, but integrated into the big picture. He knew that he played a crucial role. Without him, Armstrong and Aldrin would not have been able to return. After their work on the surface, the two astronauts climbed back into the Eagle. The engine ignited, and they took off from the moon to dock again with Collins. A critical moment, but everything went smoothly. Together, the three astronauts began their journey back to Earth. On July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific. Helicopters and naval ships rescued the crew, who left the capsule exhausted but beaming. The world celebrated them as heroes. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins had achieved what had been unimaginable thousands of years earlier. They had set foot on the moon and returned. The moon landing was more than just a technical success. It was a symbol of man's ability to realize his dreams. It showed that with courage, discipline, and cooperation, the seemingly impossible is possible. July 20, 1969 became a date that forever marked the history of mankind.
Chapter 13. Life on the Moon, Experiments and Impressions. The landing of Apollo 11 in the Mare Tranquillitatis was the culmination of a technical feat. But for the astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin, after the historic first step, another decisive phase began, working and living on the moon. Although their stay was comparatively short at just under 22 hours, they gained experience during this time that was invaluable for all subsequent missions. As soon as they stepped out of the lunar module for the first time, the astronauts experienced the unfamiliar environment. The moon's gravity is only about 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Movements felt easier, almost like jumps in slow motion. But the clunky spacesuits, weighing almost 90 kilograms on Earth, made every movement tedious. Armstrong and Aldrin had to learn to move in small hops, a more efficient gait than normal walking. The lunar soil itself was a surprise. The regolith, as the loose material on the surface is called, was soft and powdery, similar to ash. Armstrong described that his foot sank only a few centimeters. This meant that the soil was load-bearing, and the lander had not sunk into deep dust, as some had feared. At the same time, the dust stubbornly clung to everything, to the suits, to the gloves, to the instruments. Later astronauts reported that he was even carried into the space capsule, where he emitted a strange smell reminiscent of burnt gunpowder. NASA had planned a clearly defined program of experiments for Apollo 11. One of the most important was the installation of a seismometer to register possible moonquakes. It was supposed to provide information about the internal structure of the moon. Another experiment was the laser retroreflector array, an array of mirrors that still makes it possible to direct laser beams from the Earth to the moon and measure the distance with millimeter precision. These simple but ingenious devices are still working today and provide data for science. In addition to the experiments, the collection of rock samples was a central component. Armstrong and Aldrin filled bags with stones and dust, a total of about 21.5 kilograms of material. These samples would later be studied in detail on Earth and provided important insights into the age and composition of the moon. Some pieces were over 3 billion years old, evidence of a time when the solar system was still young. The astronauts also hoisted the American flag, a symbolic act that went around the world. The image of Armstrong and Aldrin next to the waving flag became an icon of the 20th century. However, in reality, the flag was not moved by the wind, but by a crossbar that spread it out, because there is no atmosphere on the moon and therefore no wind. One of the most impressive experiences was the view back to Earth. Armstrong and Aldrin described the Earth as overwhelmingly beautiful, a bright blue sphere floating in the black sky. This sight deeply marked many astronauts and became a symbol of the vulnerability and uniqueness of our planet. Life inside the landing module was also a challenge. There was hardly any space. 2 men in bulky suits squeezed into a narrow cabin surrounded by switches, cables, and instruments. Sleeping was almost impossible. The excitement too great, the conditions too uncomfortable. The spacesuits had to be worn all the time, and the atmosphere inside was controlled but dry and stuffy. Despite all their efforts, Armstrong and Aldrin stuck to their to-do lists, disciplined and methodical. The moon stay was deliberately kept short. NASA did not want to take any risks. After about 2.5 hours outside the capsule, the two returned to the Eagle, stowed samples and data, and prepared for the return launch. In this phase, the tension was enormous. Would the engine of the landing module ignite? Because there was no second chance. Failure would have meant that Armstrong and Aldrin would have been stranded on the moon. But the engine worked.
With a bright beam of light, the upper stage of the Eagle lifted off from the lunar surface and brought the astronauts back into orbit, where Michael Collins waited in the command module. The docking was precise and professional, a sign of how much the training and discipline of the crew worked. Life on the moon was only a brief foretaste of Apollo 11, but it showed that people could work, move, and do science there. For later missions, NASA planned longer stays, more experiments, vehicles for locomotion. But the experiences of Armstrong and Aldrin laid the foundation. Their reports showed that the moon was not a dead, uninteresting place, but a fascinating world with its own history. Every stone, every crater told of meteorites, volcanism, of the formation of the solar system. For humanity, it was a new perspective. The moon was no longer just a bright spot in the sky, but a place we had visited, a part of our expanded world. The impressions of Apollo 11 also changed people's self-image. The great leap for humanity was not only a technical victory, but also a cultural one. It broadened the horizon and opened the door to a new idea that perhaps one day humans could live and work permanently in space. Chapter 14. Return to Earth, Quarantine and Triumph. After Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had completed their duties on the lunar surface, the time had come to dare the hardest part, the return. For as impressive as the small step for a person had been, only the safe return home would make the mission a complete success. In the hours after the moonwalk, everything was focused on the launch of the Eagle from the moon back into orbit. The risk was enormous. The engine of the lunar landing module's ascent stage had to function flawlessly, without redundancy. If it hadn't been ignited, Armstrong and Aldrin would have been stranded on the moon forever. There was no way to save it. The world would have had to watch as two people lose their lives in a foreign land. But on July 21, 1969, after almost 22 hours on the moon, the engine ignited as planned. With a bright jet of flame, the Eagle rose into the thin layer of gray dust and disappeared into the black sky. In orbit, Michael Collins was waiting in the Columbia command module. His job was to coordinate the rendezvous and docking, a complex operation that required absolute precision. After about 4 hours, the two spacecraft met. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into the Columbia. The lunar landing module was separated and left behind. This was the end of the most dangerous phase. The three astronauts were reunited and ready for the journey back to Earth. The flight home lasted another 3 days. Unlike on the outbound flight, the astronauts were now more relaxed. They had achieved their goal and the systems worked perfectly. Collins, Armstrong, and Aldrin watched the Earth grow larger with each passing day until it filled the sky again. There was relief at the control center in Houston, but no one let their guard down. The risky re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere was still waiting. On July 24, 1969, the time had come. The command module entered the atmosphere at over 39,000 kilometers per hour, faster than any aircraft before. A heat shield protected the capsule while it was surrounded by a glowing cloud of plasma. For minutes, the radio connection was lost, a dreaded blackout. Then came the redeeming signal. The capsule had penetrated the atmosphere. A little later, the parachutes opened and Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, about 1,500 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. The rescue was meticulously planned. Helicopters and naval ships of the USS Hornet were on site. Divers secured the capsule, opened the hatch, and helped the astronauts out. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins climbed into the lifeboat, exhausted but safe. Cheers erupted when it became clear that the mission had been a complete success. But the return brought another special feature: quarantine. Scientists feared that the astronauts might have brought unknown microorganisms from the moon. Although this was considered unlikely, they did not want to take any risks. Therefore, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were taken to a special quarantine trailer, the Mobile Quarantine Facility, MQF, immediately after the rescue. From there, they were taken by plane to Houston, where they spent another 21 days in an isolated laboratory. Behind glass windows, they were able to receive visitors, including President Richard Nixon, who greeted them personally. Photos show the president laughing in front of the quarantine cabin while the 3 astronauts waved to him behind glass. This was a curiosity for the public, but it also showed how seriously NASA took scientific caution. The quarantine went without incident. Neither the astronauts nor the samples they brought with them showed any biological danger. After 3 weeks, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were released as healthy and immediately began a worldwide triumphal journey. In the USA, they were celebrated with parades in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Millions of people lined the streets, cheered, threw confetti. The astronauts became symbols of American success, heroes of the Cold War, but also ambassadors of all humanity. Their journey also took her around the world. They were received in more than 20 countries by heads of state, kings, and presidents. They were celebrated everywhere, not only as representatives of the USA, but as pioneers who had achieved something for all people. Posters and newspapers read, "They came in peace for all mankind." The scientific evaluation also began immediately. The rock samples were examined in special laboratories, and they provided crucial insights into the formation of the moon. The data from the experiments expanded our knowledge of geology, gravity, and the evolution of the solar system. So the return of Apollo 11 was much more than just bringing 3 people home safely. It was a triumphal procession, a scientific breakthrough, a cultural event. The moon was no longer unreachable, but had become part of our history. In the end, a feeling of unity remained. July 20th, 1969 was a victory for the United States in the Cold War race, but it was also a moment in which humanity looked beyond political boundaries for a moment. Millions of people, no matter in which country, had shared the same dream. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins returned as heroes, but they always emphasized that they were only the tip of a huge project. Over 400,000 people had worked on the Apollo program. Every screwdriver, every cable, every calculation was part of the success. The return of Apollo 11 was thus not only the end of a mission, but the beginning of a legacy that showed that when humanity sets a goal, it is capable of achieving the seemingly impossible.
Chapter 15. The Scientific Findings of the Apollo Missions. The Apollo 11 moon landing was a historic event of inestimable cultural and political significance. But it was not only a triumph of technology and a victory in the Cold War race, but also a huge scientific experiment. The Apollo missions gave researchers direct access to the moon, a celestial body that has remained almost unchanged for billions of years. For the first time, humanity was able to collect samples, set up experiments, and obtain data that revolutionized our knowledge of the solar system. Apollo 11 brought the first 21.5 kilograms of moon rock to Earth. But in the following missions, this amount grew considerably. In total, almost 382 kilograms of material were collected in 6 successful landings: dust, stones, drill cores. These samples are still an inexhaustible source for scientists today. They are still being tested in special laboratories, sometimes under the strictest purity conditions. Every new analytical technique that science develops is also applied to the Apollo samples. One of the most important results was the clarification of the question of the formation of the moon. Before Apollo, there were several theories. Some believed the moon was a captured asteroid, others thought it formed together with Earth. However, the analysis of the rocks showed clear similarities in the chemical composition between the Earth and the moon, and at the same time, a conspicuous lack of volatile elements on the moon. This gave rise to the theory of the giant impact that is generally accepted today. The moon was formed around 4.5 billion years ago when a Mars-sized protoplanet collided with the young Earth. Out of the rubble, our companion finally formed.
The samples also provided insights into the age and geological evolution of the moon. Basalts collected at Apollo showed that there was once volcanic activity on the moon, but over 3 billion years ago. Other rocks, called anorthosites, came from the early crust of the moon and were even older. This made the moon a contemporary witness to the early history of the solar system, an epoch that had long since been extinguished on Earth by erosion and plate tectonics. The experiments that were installed on the moon also had great value. The seismic measuring device of Apollo 11 and the improved seismometers of later missions registered small tremors, so-called moonquakes. They show that the moon is not completely dead, but has a certain internal activity. The data provided clues to the internal structure: a thin crust, a mantle, and possibly a small, partially molten core. The laser retroreflector experiment became particularly famous. With the help of the mirrors set up by Apollo astronauts, researchers can send laser beams to the moon from Earth and measure their reflection. This allows the distance to the moon to be determined with an accuracy of just a few millimeters. This experiment is still running today, more than 50 years after the moon landing. It has shown that the moon moves away from Earth by about 3.8 centimeters every year. Other experiments measured solar radiation, the influence of the solar wind, or the gravity of the moon. Particularly important were the drilling into the lunar soil, which enabled thermal measurements. This allowed scientists to learn more about the heat development and the history of the lunar surface. The Apollo missions also had an unexpected side effect. They advanced our understanding of Earth itself. Many processes studied on the moon helped to reconstruct the early history of the Earth. The crater landscape of the moon showed how intense the impacts of meteorites must have been in the young solar system, a phase that also shaped the Earth. Without the moon, we wouldn't have this look into the past. In addition, lunar research raised awareness of our planet. The famous photos such as Earthrise or the blue marble of Apollo 17 made the Earth visible as a whole for the first time. Small, vulnerable, beautiful. These images became symbols of the environmental movement, which gained importance in the 1970s. The Apollo experiments also had repercussions technologically. Many of the measuring instruments, materials, and processes used were later used in other areas, from geology to material science to computer science. Lunar research was thus a driver of innovation far beyond space travel. Not all questions were answered. Even today, scientists discuss details of the moon's history. Some samples contain unusual isotope ratios that are not fully explained. Others point to processes that may have been more complex than one thought. But that is exactly what makes the Apollo missions so valuable. They provided material that provides new insights even decades after landing. In summary, the scientific significance of the Apollo missions was enormous. They transformed the moon from a mythical object into a research celestial body. They gave us answers to questions about the formation of the Earth and the Moon, about the history of the solar system, about the nature of geological processes. They showed that manned spaceflight can deliver not only prestige, but science at the highest level. Apollo was thus not only a great leap for mankind, but also a huge step for science.
Chapter 16. Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem. After the triumph of Apollo 11 and the successful follow-up missions Apollo 12 and 14, the trip to the moon was almost considered routine. But in 1970, Apollo 13 showed that space travel can never be taken for granted. The mission, which was supposed to be the third landing on the moon, developed into a drama that kept the world in suspense, and, in the end, a story of courage, improvisation, and team spirit. The crew consisted of James Lovell, an experienced astronaut who had already flown Apollo 8 around the moon, as well as Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert. Originally, Ken Mattingly was supposed to fly as a pilot of the command module, but a few days before launch, he was replaced because of possible measles. Jack Swigert stepped in at short notice.
This change alone showed how flexible NASA had to be in responding to unforeseen circumstances. On April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center. Everything went normally at first. The Saturn V brought the space capsule safely on course for the Moon. The astronauts began the usual checks, course corrections, and preparations. The mood was relaxed. Lovell jokingly radioed to the ground, "Houston, we've had a smooth ride so far." But the calm was not to last long. On April 13th, 2 days after launch and about 320,000 kilometers from Earth, the catastrophe occurred. The crew should routinely mix an oxygen tank to prevent deposits. Swigert flipped the switch, and suddenly an explosion shook the spaceship. Lights flashed, alarms shrill. The astronauts felt a blow. The spacecraft began to sway. Lovell looked out the window and saw gas escaping into space. Then followed the legendary radio message, "Houston, we've had a problem here." It became quiet in the control center in Houston. Engineers feverishly tried to understand the data. It soon became clear that an oxygen tank in the service module had exploded and severely damaged the energy supply. 2 of the 3 fuel cells had failed, and the pressure in the oxygen tanks dropped rapidly. Without oxygen, there was no electricity, no water, no air. The moon landing was immediately canceled. Now it was all a matter of survival. NASA and the crew had to improvise. The command module was badly damaged, so they decided to use the lunar landing module, Aquarius, as a lifeboat. It was actually intended for 2 astronauts and a stay of 45 hours on the moon. Now 3 men had to survive in it for several days. Oxygen, electricity, and water were scarce. The engineers in Houston worked around the clock to find solutions. Electricity had to be saved. Almost all systems in the command module were switched off. The instruments in the landing module were reduced to a minimum. The temperature dropped. Condensation formed on the walls. The astronauts froze in their spacesuits. Water was strictly rationed. Everyone was only allowed to drink a few sips a day. Another problem was carbon dioxide. The filters in the lunar landing module were not sufficient to clean the air breathed by 3 people for days. But there were replacement filters in the command module, but in a different form. In Houston, engineers improvised a solution with hoses, plastic bags, and tape to fit the angular filters of the command module into the round openings of the landing module. The astronauts rebuilt the construction, and it worked. It was a symbol of the creativity and cooperation between the ground and the crew. The trajectory also had to be changed. Without the service module, they could not simply fly back to Earth. Instead, the engineers decided to orbit the moon and use gravity for a free return trajectory, a trajectory that automatically brought them back to Earth. The maneuver required precise ignitions of the engine in the landing module, which the astronauts carried out with great difficulty. During the days in the lunar landing module, the crew suffered from cold, lack of sleep, and stress. But they kept their nerve, worked through their checklists in a disciplined manner, and trusted the instructions from Houston. Millions of people around the world followed the events on television, feared for the astronauts, and hoped for a happy ending. On April 17th, after almost 6 days in crisis, the decisive moment came: re-entry. The damaged service module was separated, and for the first time the astronauts saw the extent of the destruction. An entire page was torn open, metal bent, cables shredded. Then they also separated the lunar landing module that had served as a lifeboat. Only the small command module remained to reach Earth. Entering the atmosphere was a moment of high tension. No one knew if the improvised systems had been enough to keep the capsule stable. Again, the dreaded radio silence came as the capsule plunged into the plasma cloud. Seconds turned into minutes. The world held its breath. Then, finally, the redeeming signal: Odyssey, Houston, you are go. The parachutes opened, and Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Pacific. The relief was boundless. Cheers broke out worldwide. An almost certain catastrophe had turned into a successful failure, a failed flight to the moon, but a triumphant rescue of 3 people. The astronauts were hailed as heroes, as were the engineers and flight controllers who had made the impossible possible. Apollo 13 showed that space travel is never routine. It revealed the dangers lurking in space, but also the strength of team spirit, knowledge, and the art of improvisation. In a way, it was the mission that taught the most, not about the moon, but about the people who wanted to reach it.
Chapter 17. The Last Apollo Missions, Climax and End. After the dramatic rescue of Apollo 13, NASA was under pressure. On the one hand, the program had proven that it could master even the greatest crises, but on the other hand, it had become clear how dangerous space travel remained. At the same time, the political and social mood in the USA changed. The Vietnam War, social tensions, and the immense costs of the Apollo program led to the fact that enthusiasm for further moon flights gradually waned. Nevertheless, the remaining missions were to show that Apollo was not only a political triumph, but also a scientific highlight. Apollo 14, the return after the shock. In February 1971, Apollo 14 was launched. On board were Alan Shepard, the first American in space, Edgar Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa. The mission was crucial to restoring confidence after Apollo 13. Shepard and Mitchell landed in the Fra Mauro Highlands, where Apollo 13 was supposed to land. They carried out extensive geological investigations, collected around 43 kilograms of rock, and drilled into the lunar soil. Shepard became famous when he hit 2 golf balls over the surface with a modified club at the end of the mission, a symbolic, almost humorous moment that showed that people retained their playful spirit even in the face of the greatest technological achievements. Apollo 15, the beginning of the J missions. Apollo 15 in July 1971 marked the beginning of a new phase, the so-called J missions. These were longer, more scientifically ambitious, and technically better equipped. On board were David Scott, James Irwin, and Alfred Worden. For the first time, the astronauts used a vehicle on the moon, the Lunar Roving Vehicle, an electrically powered car that allowed them to work several kilometers from the landing site. This allowed them to explore much larger areas and collect more extensive samples. In total, Scott and Irwin stayed on the surface for nearly 3 days, more than twice as long as Armstrong and Aldrin did on Apollo 11. A highlight was the discovery of Genesis rock, a bright anorthosite that was more than 4 billion years old and is considered part of the early lunar crust. This rock provided crucial clues to the formation of the moon. Apollo 15 proved that the moon missions not only produced spectacular images, but also tangible scientific results. Apollo 16, exploring the highlands. In April 1972, Apollo 16 followed with John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly. Their destination was the Descartes Highlands, a region that was particularly interesting geologically. They also used the lunar car and covered almost 27 kilometers, an enormous distance compared to the conditions. Young and Duke conducted numerous experiments and brought back 95 kilograms of rock. However, Apollo 16 also showed the difficulties of such missions. A fault in the propulsion system of the lunar module almost led to the landing having to be aborted. In the end, however, the astronauts were able to perform their tasks to a large extent and once again provided valuable data. Apollo 17, the last flight. The last mission, Apollo 17, in December 1972, marked the high point of the program. On board were Eugene Cernan, Harrison Jack Schmitt, and Ronald Evans. Schmitt was the first and only trained geologist to set foot on the moon, a clear sign that NASA was now focusing on the scientific aspect. Apollo 17 broke several records: longest stay on the moon, over 75 hours, longest spacewalks, over 22 hours, longest distance with the lunar car, almost 36 kilometers,
and largest amount of samples, over 110 kilograms. The crew investigated the Taurus Littrow Valley, a region of mountains and valleys that offered evidence of volcanic activity and impacts. Eugene Cernan spoke words as he left the lunar surface that became a legacy. As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record. That America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. He hoped that humanity would return soon. But to this day, more than 50 years later, Cernan is the last person to set foot on the moon. The end of Apollo. Why did they stop when the missions became more and more successful and scientifically valuable? The reasons were mainly in politics and costs. The Apollo program had devoured more than $25 billion, a sum that was considered too high in view of the Vietnam War and social problems. Public attention had dropped significantly after Apollo 11. What still captivated millions of people in front of the television in 1969 was perceived almost routinely in 1972. In addition, the original goal, to bring a man to the moon and bring him back safely, had already been achieved. For many politicians, it was difficult to justify spending billions on more scientific missions when urgent problems on Earth remained unsolved. Planned missions such as Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. The legacy. Despite the abrupt end, Apollo left behind a tremendous legacy. In just 3 years, 12 men had set foot on the moon, collected almost 400 kilograms of rock, drove vehicles, conducted experiments, and collected data that still enriches science today. Apollo showed that humanity is capable of making a seemingly unattainable vision a reality. It was not just a chapter of space travel, but a cultural event that inspired generations. The last few missions proved that the moon is not only a symbol, but also a unique field of research, and that we need to return to it if we want to fully understand the history of the solar system.
Chapter 18. Implications for Politics, Society, and Culture. The Apollo moon landings were much more than technical or scientific achievements. They had a profound impact on politics, society, and culture, not only in the USA, but worldwide. The Great Leap for Humanity changed people's self-image, influenced the Cold War, shaped art and media, and inspired generations of scientists and dreamers. Politics. Victory in the race. Politically, the Apollo missions were above all a triumph for the United States. Since Sputnik in 1957 and Gagarin's flight in 1961, the Soviets have always been ahead in the space race. With Apollo 11, the tide finally turned. The USA was the first nation to put humans on the moon, and within the deadline set by Kennedy. This was a prestige gain of inestimable value. In the context of the Cold War, the moon landing showed that the American system was capable of implementing a formidable technical vision. It was also a message to the world. The West, democracy, and the market economy could achieve more than the centralized Soviet Union. For many countries that vacillated between East and West, this was a strong signal. At the same time, Apollo became a diplomatic instrument. After the missions, the astronauts went on goodwill tours around the world and were welcomed everywhere as heroes. Even in countries that were critical of the United States, there was respect. The program strengthened the international reputation of the United States like hardly any other event. Society, pride, and skepticism. Within the USA, the moon landings had an ambivalent effect. On the one hand, there was pride. Millions of people followed the live broadcasts. Schools and universities celebrated the astronauts as role models, and children dreamed of flying into space themselves. Apollo was a symbol of national strength that united people of different origins. On the other hand, there was also criticism. Even during the Apollo program, many asked whether the immense costs, over $25 billion, would not be better used for social problems, education, or the fight against poverty and racism.
In the midst of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, the images of astronauts in the moon dust seemed to some like an escape from Earth's real problems. These tensions shaped public perception. While Apollo 11 still triggered enthusiasm worldwide, interest in later missions dropped noticeably. For many, the moon became routine and television reported increasingly soberly. Nevertheless, Apollo remained a formative event that strengthened the self-confidence of an entire nation. Culture, the moon in art and media. The cultural impact of the moon landings was enormous. The moon has always been a symbol in myths, fairy tales, and art. Now he was suddenly available in real life. Artists, writers, and filmmakers took up the topic. Science fiction, which had previously often been dismissed as fantasy, gained new credibility. Films such as 2001: A Space Odyssey, 1968, or series such as Star Trek reflected the fascination of the space age. Motifs of the moon and space travel also appeared in the visual arts, from pop art icons to abstract interpretations. Music pieces such as David Bowie's Space Odyssey became anthems of a generation that saw space as a projection screen for dreams and fears. In the media, the moon landing was a global event that demonstrated the power of television. Around 600 million people watched Armstrong's first move live, a record that remained unbroken for decades. The images of the moon became icons of the 20th century, comparable to photos of historical events such as the end of the Second World War or the fall of the Berlin Wall. Science and education, inspiration for generations. Another important effect was the effect on education and science. Thousands of young people chose careers in science, technology, and engineering in the 1970s, inspired by Apollo. The astronauts became heroic figures, and the idea that ordinary people could also become part of such projects through education and hard work was a powerful incentive. Interest in environmental issues was also indirectly strengthened by Apollo. The famous photos such as Earthrise or the blue marble of Apollo 17 showed the Earth as a vulnerable, blue sphere in the infinite black of space. Many saw it as a symbol of the fragility of our planet, which spurred movements for environmental protection and global responsibility. Myths and conspiracies. With the cultural significance came doubts and myths. Shortly after Apollo 11, conspiracy theories began to spread, claiming that the moon landing was staged. Some people simply couldn't imagine that such an achievement was possible. Others mistrusted the government in times of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. Although these theories have long been scientifically refuted, the evidence from rock samples, laser experiments, and independent observations is clear. They show how strongly Apollo also served as a projection screen for mistrust and skepticism. A global event. Despite all the criticism, the moon landing was more than an American event. It was celebrated worldwide. In cities from Moscow to Nairobi, from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro, people gathered to see the images. Armstrong's words, "for all mankind," were not an empty formula, but reflected the feeling that a moment for everyone was taking place here. The moon thus became a symbol of unity. Even though Apollo was part of the Cold War, it connected humanity in a moment of shared attention. For many, it was proof that, despite all the conflicts, we are capable of common, peaceful goals.
Chapter 19: The End of the Apollo Program and the Transition to Skylab and Shuttle. When Eugene Cernan took the last steps on the moon in December 1972, the end of the Apollo program had already been decided. Although the missions were technically and scientifically successful, the political and social mood had changed. Apollo was born out of the Cold War race, Kennedy's vision, and the national rivalry with the Soviet Union. But after the goal was reached, humans on the moon and safely back, the question arose, what now? Reasons for the end. There were several reasons why Apollo was not continued. The most important was money. Apollo had cost the USA over $25 billion, more than $150 billion in today's purchasing power.
At a time when the Vietnam War devoured billions and domestic political conflicts grew, it no longer seemed justifiable to many politicians to spend more billions on moon flights. Public interest also waned. Apollo 11 had thrilled millions worldwide, but Apollo 12 already reached significantly fewer viewers. For many people, the moon landing after 1969 seemed like routine. The extraordinary had worn out. Newspapers reported more soberly, television stations shortened their broadcasts. After all, a clear vision was missing. After the goal of man on the moon was achieved, there was no new political challenge that was as inspiring. Although scientists discussed bases on the moon or flights to Mars, such plans were too ambitious financially and technologically. For example, Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were canceled, although the hardware for them already existed in some cases. Rockets that were originally intended for these missions were repurposed for other projects, most notably Skylab. Skylab, America's first space station. In 1973, Skylab started a new chapter. The U.S. used a converted third stage of a Saturn V to launch a space station into space. Skylab was the first and only U.S. space station of the 1970s. It offered space for 3 astronauts who could live and work there for several weeks. Skylab was an attempt to translate the experience of Apollo into a more long-term space program. The astronauts conducted medical experiments to explore the effects of weightlessness on the human body. They observed the sun with telescopes, made Earth observations, and carried out repair work in space. 3 missions between 1973 and 1974 showed that humans could survive and work in space for longer periods of time. Skylab was thus an important step towards the later space stations such as Mir and ISS. However, the project was limited by the tight budget, and the station burned up uncontrollably in the atmosphere in 1979. Apollo-Soyuz, cooperation in the Cold War. In 1975, an emblematic project was launched, Apollo-Soyuz. A U.S. Apollo spacecraft docked with the Soviet Soyuz capsule, the first joint space project of the superpowers. The crews worked together, exchanged gifts, and conducted experiments. In the midst of the Cold War, this was a sign of détente and the possibility of international cooperation. Apollo-Soyuz marked the last time an Apollo spacecraft flew. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one that relied more on collaboration. Transition to the Space Shuttle. After Apollo, NASA was looking for a new program that would make space travel more affordable and regular. The answer was the Space Shuttle. Instead of gigantic, disposable rockets like the Saturn V, a reusable spacecraft was to be developed that could take off and land like an airplane. The shuttle was designed as a truck into space that could transport satellites, supply space stations, and carry out experiments. In the 1980s and 1990s, it became a symbol of U.S. space travel. But the road to get there was long. After the end of Apollo, it took almost a decade for the shuttle to actually fly. During this time, Skylab was the only U.S. contribution to manned spaceflight. The loss of the Saturn V. With the end of Apollo, a unique technology was also lost. The Saturn V was the most powerful rocket ever built, but it was no longer produced after 1973. Parts of the remaining rockets ended up in museums. For decades, no nation has been able to launch a similar payload into space. It was not until the 21st century that programs such as SpaceX's Starship or NASA's SLS began to connect to these dimensions. Psychological effect. The end of Apollo also left a psychological void. Many people had believed that the moon landing was the beginning of a new era, with bases on the moon, missions to Mars, perhaps even interplanetary space travel. Instead, it seemed as if humanity had climbed a peak and then returned, without continuing on the path. For some, this was a disappointment. At the same time, it was a realistic step. Resources were limited, and political priorities were different. Apollo was not so much a continuous development as a one-time feat of strength, a monument to the Cold War. The legacy. Despite the abrupt end, Apollo remains a milestone. Without the experience of the last missions, without Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz, the international cooperation of the later decades, from the ISS to Artemis, would hardly have been conceivable. Apollo was thus not only a highlight, but also a transition. Humanity had proven that it could reach the moon. Now began a phase in which one had to learn to live and work in space in the long term. Apollo had opened the door. Skylab and the shuttle led through.
Chapter 20. The Legacy of the Moon Landing, Inspiration for the Future. The Apollo missions ended in 1972, but their legacy continues to have an impact today. The Great Leap for Humanity was not only a technical triumph, but a cultural turning point. The images of Neil Armstrong's first step, the words from the Mare Tranquillitatis, and the photos of the Earth in space are among the most powerful symbols of the 20th century. But the legacy of the moon landing is much more than history. It shapes the present and inspires the future. Technological progress. Apollo was a catalyst for technological developments. Many of the technologies developed for the missions later found their way into other areas. Microelectronics, lightweight materials, communication technology, medical technology. The need to make systems light, reliable, and efficient accelerated innovations that had an impact far beyond space travel. Computers that still filled entire rooms in the 1960s were miniaturized in the course of Apollo. Without this boost, the development of modern computers, smartphones, and digital technologies would have been slower. Apollo also set standards in materials research, for example in heat-resistant alloys or insulation. Inspiration for generations. The sentimental value was perhaps even greater. Millions of children and young people around the world watched the moon landing on television. Many then decided to pursue careers in science and technology. Engineers, astronomers, and researchers in the decades that followed often cited Apollo as an inspiration. The idea that people could reach the moon with courage, cooperation, and knowledge became a symbol of the seemingly impossible being possible. Apollo showed that big dreams are not luxuries, but engines of progress. Influence on environmental awareness. One of the unexpected consequences of the moon landing was the new view of the Earth. The photos, such as Earthrise or the blue marble of Apollo 17, shaped the collective consciousness. For the first time, humanity saw its planet from the outside, small, vulnerable, beautiful. These images had a great influence on the environmental movement of the 1970s. They made it clear that the Earth is not an inexhaustible space, but a fragile system that must be protected. Many historians see Apollo as an indirect trigger for the growing sensitivity to climate change, nature conservation, and global responsibility. Political legacy. Politically, Apollo was primarily a product of the Cold War, but its legacy extends beyond that. The program showed that international cooperation in space is possible and useful. Projects such as Apollo-Soyuz, later the ISS, and now the Artemis program are building on this. Today, it is not only states, but also private companies such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, or Rocket Lab that carry on the vision. Apollo remains a benchmark. Every new mission is measured against this historic moment. Today, when plans for moon bases or Mars flights are made again, they do so in the shadow and light of Apollo. Limits and disappointments. However, the legacy is not all positive. Many people felt it was a disappointment that humanity did not continue consistently after Apollo. No bases on the moon, no flight to Mars. Instead, decades without a return to the moon. For some, this shows that grand visions often fail due to political and financial realities. But here, too, there is a lesson. Apollo was not the norm, but the exception.
a huge feat of strength made possible by the pressure of the Cold War and the enormous investment of resources. Today, with the focus on international cooperation and private initiative, space travel could be made more sustainable and long-term. Return to the Moon, Artemis and beyond. In recent years, the vision of the Moon has been experiencing a renaissance. With the Artemis program, NASA wants to bring humans to the Moon again by the end of the decade, this time with international support and with the goal of a permanent presence. China is also planning its own lunar missions, and private companies are developing technologies for transport and infrastructure. The goal is not only to set foot on the Moon again, but to use it as a springboard to Mars. The Moon could serve as a testing ground for technologies that will one day enable interplanetary travel, life support systems, energy supply, resource extraction. In a way, Apollo thus becomes the basis of a new epoch, this time with the claim not only to visit the Moon, but to inhabit it. Cultural heritage. The legacy of the Moon landing is also culturally inexhaustible. Literature, films, art, and music have taken up Apollo countless times. From science fiction stories to alternative futures to documentaries and feature films, the Moon landing remains a myth, a symbol of human audacity. In the collective memory, it is one of the rare stories in which humanity has achieved something really great together. It is an alternative to war and destruction, proof that we can also use our energy for peaceful, visionary goals. Result: the legacy of the Moon landing is complex. It consists of scientific findings, technological innovations, cultural symbols, and idealistic values. Apollo was a product of its time, the Cold War, the 1960s, Kennedy's vision. But it was also a step out of this time, a glimpse into a future in which humanity can transcend its limits. When we talk about Mars missions, space stations, or interplanetary colonies today, we do so with the awareness of what happened in 1969. Armstrong's small step remains the benchmark for all the big dreams that follow. Apollo was the beginning of a story that is not yet over.